May 14, 1944. Monte Majo, Italy. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Senger and Etterlin crouched in a concrete bunker overlooking the Liri Valley, hands trembling as he read the field report that had just arrived from his forward positions. His staff officers stood silent, faces ashen, unwilling to meet his eyes. The report described something that contradicted every assumption Wehrmacht commanders had made about the Italian campaign, about Allied capabilities, about the impregnability of the Gustav line that had stopped British, American, and Free French forces for 5 months. Von Senger read aloud, his voice hollow. Positions 14 through 23 have fallen. Enemy forces bypassed our defensive works entirely, ascending cliffs we deemed unscalable. They moved through darkness without light, without sound, without mercy. Sentries were found dead at their posts, throats cut without having fired a shot or raised an alarm. The attackers are not regular Allied infantry. They are Moroccan mountain troops, Goumiers, and they fight like nothing we have encountered in this war. Our defensive line, which held against armored divisions and massed artillery, is collapsing before men armed with knives. The Gustav line had been declared impregnable. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commanding German forces in Italy, had boasted to Hitler that the Allies would shatter themselves against fortifications anchored on Monte Cassino and the surrounding mountains. For 149 days, from January through May 1944, the Allies had hurled division after division against German positions. The British 46th Division was decimated. The American 36th Division lost over 2,000 men in a single catastrophic river crossing. The 2nd New Zealand Division fought for weeks without breaking through. Polish forces climbed Monte Cassino slopes 4 times and were thrown back in ruins. The finest armies of the Western Allies, supported by overwhelming artillery and air power, had accomplished nothing except filling cemeteries and proving German boasts were justified. Then came the Goumiers. In 72 hours, these Moroccan mountain fighters from the Atlas Mountains accomplished what 5 months of conventional warfare could not. They broke the Gustav line's western anchor. They opened the road to Rome. They proved that the most sophisticated defensive system in military history could be defeated by soldiers who fought with methods the Germans never anticipated, never understood, and could not counter. The mathematics of impossibility were being rewritten not in tactical manuals, but in the screams of German sentries dying silently in darkness, in the collapse of positions deemed unassailable, in the shattering of confidence that the Gustav line represented German mastery of defensive warfare. By May 17th, the entire German defensive system would be in collapse, forced into retreat by an army of North African tribesmen whom Allied commanders had initially dismissed as primitive auxiliaries, unsuited for modern warfare. The roots of this improbable victory lay not in European military academies, but in the mountain villages of Morocco's Atlas Range. October 1942, the offices of the French Protectorate in Rabat, Morocco. General Augustin Guillaume, a 54-year-old colonial officer who had spent 2 decades commanding indigenous troops in North Africa, stood before a map of Morocco's Atlas Mountains, explaining to skeptical Free French staff officers why recruiting Berber tribesmen represented France's best hope for creating effective light infantry. Guillaume's proposal seemed absurd to officers trained in conventional European warfare. The Atlas Mountain Berbers, whom the French called Goumiers, from the Arabic word for tribal war band, were semi-nomadic people living in conditions that had changed little in centuries. They had no experience with modern weapons, no formal military training, no tradition of following European military discipline. Many were illiterate, most spoke only Berber dialects. Their lifestyle centered on herding livestock, subsistence farming, and occasional tribal feuds settled with knives and old rifles. Colonel Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, commanding Free French forces preparing for operations in Italy, examined Guillaume's recruitment proposal with barely concealed contempt. His response, recorded in meeting minutes preserved in French military archives, captured conventional wisdom about indigenous troops. General Guillaume proposes we recruit mountain tribesmen who cannot read, who have never seen a tank or aircraft, who fight tribal wars with knives and primitive weapons. He suggests these men will somehow prove superior to trained infantry in mountain warfare against the Wehrmacht. This is romanticism, not military planning. The Germans in Italy are veterans of the Russian front, hardened by years of combat. They occupy fortifications built by their finest engineers. They will slaughter these primitive warriors, and we will be responsible for sending them to pointless deaths. Guillaume's response revealed understanding born from decades commanding North African troops. He walked to the mountain map and traced the defensive lines German forces had established across Italy's Apennine spine. Gentlemen, the Germans in Italy have created fortress systems anchored on mountains. Every conventional assault has failed because the Germans occupy high ground, dominate approaches, and can concentrate fire on predictable attack routes. We attack where they are strongest because European military doctrine says we must seize high ground frontally. The Goumiers do not think this way. To them, mountains are not obstacles but home terrain. They climb cliffs we consider impassable. They move at night through terrain where our troops get lost. They navigate by stars and terrain features, not maps. They kill silently with knives before using firearms. Most important, they fight for reasons European soldiers barely understand: personal honor, tribal reputation, and loyalty to officers who respect their customs. These men will go where our regular infantry cannot, do what our troops will not attempt, and fight with intensity that terrifies enemies accustomed to rational warfare. The Free French Command authorized Guillaume to raise 4 Groupements de Tabors Marocains, Moroccan tabor groups, each consisting of 3 to 4 tabors of approximately 900 men. The recruits came from Morocco's most remote mountain regions, the High Atlas, Middle Atlas, and Rif ranges. They brought with them traditions of mountain warfare refined over centuries of tribal conflict and resistance to colonial authority. Lieutenant Augustin Guillaume Jr., the general's son who served as a liaison officer with Goumiers units, described the recruitment process in his memoir. The men who volunteered came from villages accessible only by foot trails. Many had never seen a city. They arrived wearing traditional djellabas and turbans, carrying personal knives that had been family possessions for generations. Our first task was not training but establishing mutual respect. French officers who treated Goumiers as ignorant savages failed immediately. Those who recognized that these men possessed skills we lacked: mountain navigation, silent movement, knife fighting, endurance, earned loyalty that proved unbreakable in combat. The training program departed radically from conventional military preparation. French instructors taught Goumiers to use modern rifles, grenades, and mortars, but they did not attempt to impose European infantry tactics. Instead, they enhanced existing skills. Goumiers already knew how to move silently through mountains at night. They simply needed to coordinate these movements with French artillery and air support. They already knew how to kill enemies quietly. They simply needed to apply these skills against German positions rather than tribal rivals. What emerged was a hybrid force combining modern firepower with ancient mountain warfare techniques. Goumiers carried standard French rifles and grenades, but they also carried their traditional knives, tools that would prove psychologically devastating to German defenders. They wore a mixture of French military uniforms and traditional Moroccan clothing, particularly the distinctive striped djellabas that became their trademark. They operated in small, independent groups led by Moroccan NCOs who understood terrain and tribal dynamics, supported by French officers who coordinated with conventional forces. The first tests came in the Sicily campaign of July 1943. American General George S. Patton, initially skeptical of the Goumiers attached to his 7th Army, changed his assessment after watching them operate. His diary entry from July 18, 1943, revealed grudging admiration. "The Moroccan mountain troops are unlike any soldiers I have commanded. They disappear into rocky terrain where my infantry gets pinned down. They appear behind German positions without triggering alarms. They take objectives with minimal casualties by infiltrating rather than assaulting frontally. They are also completely terrifying to face. German prisoners report that their units fear the Moroccans more than American infantry because the Goumiers kill silently and appear without warning. This is psychological warfare I did not anticipate and cannot replicate with conventional troops." By the time Allied forces prepared to assault the Gustav Line in early 1944, the Goumiers had established reputations as exceptional mountain fighters. But the Italian mountains presented challenges beyond anything they had faced in North Africa or Sicily. The Gustav Line stretched across Italy from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Adriatic, anchored on mountains reaching over 500 meters in height. German engineers had spent months fortifying every approach, mining every trail, positioning machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire, and preparing artillery concentrations on every likely attack route. The western anchor of the Gustav Line rested on a cluster of mountains dominating the Liri Valley. Monte Cassino, with its historic monastery, Monte Maio, Monte Faito, and Monte Revole. British forces had attacked Monte Cassino 4 times between January and March 1944. Each assault collapsed under German defensive fire. American forces attempted to outflank the position by crossing the Rapido River and were slaughtered. The 36th Infantry Division lost 1,181 men in 48 hours, gaining nothing. Polish forces finally captured the Cassino Monastery ruins in May after weeks of fighting that left their division shattered. General Alphonse Juin, commanding the French Expeditionary Corps in Italy, studied the Gustav Line throughout April 1944 and reached a conclusion that contradicted conventional military wisdom. The Germans expected attacks along valleys and roads where armor and artillery could operate. They had fortified these approaches to the point of impregnability, but the mountain ridges between major positions, terrain the Germans considered too difficult for military operations, offered potential infiltration routes. Juin's operational plan, presented to Allied commanders on April 20, 1944, proposed sending Goumier units through the Aurunci Mountains, a particularly rugged section west of Monte Cassino that the Germans had defended lightly, precisely because they deemed the terrain impassable for military forces. British General Harold Alexander, commanding Allied forces in Italy, listened to Juin's presentation with visible skepticism. His response, recorded by Juin's chief of staff, reflected doubt shared by most Allied commanders. General Juin proposes infiltrating the Gustav Line through mountains so difficult that German forces have not bothered to fortify them heavily. He suggests that Moroccan tribal fighters will succeed where trained British and American divisions have failed for months. This seems optimistic at best. However, since conventional assaults have accomplished nothing except casualties, we have little to lose by attempting this unorthodox approach. The operation began on the night of May 11th and 12th, 1944. 4 groupements of Goumiers, approximately 12,000 men, moved into the Aurunci Mountains under cover of darkness. They carried minimal equipment, rifles, grenades, knives, and limited rations. They traveled light because their mission required speed and stealth over firepower and logistics. Captain Pierre Layaute, French liaison officer with the 4th Tabor Moroccan, described the infiltration in his combat diary. "We moved through terrain where maps showed only contour lines and no trails. The Goumiers navigated by terrain features, distinctive rock formations, vegetation changes, star positions. They climbed slopes I would have sworn were impossible for military movement. They moved silently, communicating with hand signals and whispered Berber. When we encountered German sentries, The Goumiers killed them so quietly that positions 50 meters away never knew. By dawn, we had penetrated 3 kilometers behind the Gustav line's forward positions, and the Germans did not know we were there. The psychological impact on German defenders proved as significant as the tactical penetration. Wehrmacht soldiers in the Gustav line had grown confident through months of successful defense. They occupied positions they knew were impregnable to frontal assault. They followed procedures refined through years of combat experience. Then the Goumiers appeared. Gefreiter Hans Mueller, machine gunner in the 94th Infantry Division holding positions in the Armies Mountains, survived the initial Goumier assault and later described it to American interrogators. The attack came at night. We heard nothing, no artillery preparation, no engine sounds, no radio traffic. The first indication was when the sentry in the next bunker stopped responding to radio checks. We assumed equipment failure. Then we heard screaming. Not combat screaming, terror. The Moroccans appeared out of darkness. They moved through minefields that should have stopped any advance. They climbed cliffs we thought impossible to scale. They killed sentries without firing shots. When they did use firearms, they fired from positions we never anticipated, behind us, above us, from directions that should have been secure. The officers ordered us to hold positions, but how do you defend against enemies who appear where they should not exist? We fought. We died. The survivors retreated because staying meant being killed in darkness by men we could not see. The Goumiers' tactical approach exploited every weakness in German defensive planning. The Germans had positioned their strongest defenses along valley approaches where roads existed. The Goumiers bypassed these positions entirely, moving through roadless terrain. The Germans had established interlocking fields of fire covering predictable attack routes. The Goumiers attacked from unpredictable directions, appearing on ridgelines and slopes the Germans considered secure. The Germans relied on mines and obstacles to channel attackers into kill zones. The Goumiers, traveling light and moving carefully, either avoided minefields or cleared paths through them with techniques learned in mountain warfare against tribal enemies. Most devastatingly, the Goumiers exploited darkness in ways that negated German defensive advantages. Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized defensive fire discipline and coordinated response to attacks. These procedures assumed defenders could see attackers, could identify threat directions, could concentrate fire effectively. Against Goumiers, moving silently through darkness, German defenders found themselves isolated and terrified, unable to coordinate response, uncertain where threats originated, dying before they could effectively engage. Sergeant Sai Mohammed Ben Ali, a Goumier squad leader from the High Atlas, described night combat in an interview conducted by French military historians in 1947. The French officers asked how we moved through mountains at night without light, how we knew where German positions were, how we killed sentries silently. These questions showed they did not understand. In the Atlas, we hunted at night because game is active then. We navigated by stars, by wind direction, by the shape of ridgelines against sky. We found enemies by sound, by smell, by the small things, tobacco smoke, cooking odors, the metal sounds of equipment. We killed silently because in tribal warfare, alerting an enemy's camp meant death for raiders. These were not special skills we learned for war. These were normal skills any Atlas warrior possessed. The Germans were good soldiers, but they were valley fighters trying to defend mountains. Against mountain fighters, they had no chance. The collapse of German positions in the Armies Mountains cascaded rapidly. On May 13th, Goumiers captured Monte Faito after infiltrating behind German positions and attacking downward, reversing the usual dynamic where attackers climbed toward defenders. On May 14th, they seized Monte Mayo, a key position dominating the Liri Valley. By May 15th, they had penetrated so deeply behind German lines that the entire western anchor of the Gustav line became untenable. The German response revealed institutional inability to counter tactics outside their doctrinal experience. Major General Eberhard Roth, commanding the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division responsible for the Aurunchi sector, attempted to organize counterattacks to restore defensive positions. His after-action report, captured by Allied forces when Rome fell, detailed the futility. Counterattacks failed because we could not identify clear enemy positions to attack. The Moroccans did not occupy captured positions in strength. They filtered through our lines, ambushed supply. Columns attacked headquarters and artillery positions, then disappeared before we could respond. Conventional tactics proved useless. We needed light infantry trained in mountain warfare to counter them. We had mechanized troops designed for mobile warfare on flat terrain. The mismatch was absolute. Field Marshal Kesselring, receiving reports of the Gustav Line's collapse, initially refused to believe Moroccan tribal fighters had achieved what Allied armies could not. His response to subordinate commanders, recorded in German military communications intercepted by Allied intelligence, revealed the cognitive dissonance. Reports indicate native colonial troops have penetrated positions that stopped British and American divisions for months. This seems impossible. These are primitive soldiers facing our best defensive works. Commanders on the ground must be exaggerating or panicking. The Gustav Line will hold. Within 48 hours, Kesselring was ordering full retreat from the Gustav Line because continued defense had become impossible. The human cost of the Goumiers breakthrough fell disproportionately on German forces, psychologically broken by facing enemies whose tactics they could not counter. Casualties from Goumiers attacks often showed evidence of knife wounds, throats cut, deaths by silent killing that terrified survivors. German soldiers who had faced Russian assaults, British artillery barrages, and American armored attacks without breaking reported being terrified of Goumiers night raids. Oberst Wilhelm Rapke, commanding a regiment that fought Goumiers in the Aurunchi Mountains, provided the most comprehensive German assessment in his debriefing after capture. The Moroccans were the most effective light infantry we faced in the entire war. Not because they had superior weapons or numbers, but because they fought in ways we could not anticipate or counter. Our defensive doctrine assumed rational enemies following conventional tactics. The Goumiers were rational, but not conventional. They attacked where we were weakest because they could go where we could not. They killed silently because they could, creating terror without firing shots. They moved at night because darkness favored them. Against such enemies, our fortifications meant nothing. We could not defend against threats appearing from directions we had not fortified because we thought those directions impossible. That was our fatal error. To them, impossible meant opportunity. The strategic consequences rippled across the Italian campaign. The Gustav Line's collapse forced German retreat to the Hitler Line, a secondary defensive position that proved even less effective against Goumier tactics. On June 4, 1944, Allied forces entered Rome, the first Axis capital to fall. The Goumiers' breakthrough at the Gustav Line made this possible. General Mark Clark, commanding American Fifth Army, acknowledged Goumier contribution in a message to General Juin on June 5th. The capture of Rome would not have been possible without the extraordinary performance of your Moroccan troops. They accomplished in 3 days what conventional forces could not achieve in 5 months. Their courage, tactical innovation, and battlefield effectiveness have proven decisive. The United States Army salutes the Goumiers. Yet the Goumiers' success came with dark complications that would stain their reputation. During the advance through Italy, multiple Goumier units committed atrocities against Italian civilians, rape, murder, and looting that violated laws of war and codes of military conduct. These crimes, particularly widespread sexual violence against women in villages the Goumiers passed through, became known as Maroccinat and left lasting trauma in Italian communities. French commanders struggled to control Goumier behavior during rapid advances. General Guillaume, who had recruited and trained these forces, faced the bitter reality that soldiers effective in combat could also be perpetrators of war crimes. His attempts to maintain discipline revealed the fundamental tension in employing warriors whose effectiveness derived partly from cultural practices incompatible with Western military law. Captain Jacques de Rohan, French military police officer assigned to investigate Goumiers crimes in June 1944, documented the command crisis in confidential reports. The Goumiers units that broke the Gustav line have committed systematic crimes against Italian civilians. French officers report that attempts to impose discipline are complicated by cultural factors. Many Goumiers view spoils of war, including sexual access to conquered populations, as traditional rights. Our most effective fighters are also our most problematic troops. We face a moral and practical dilemma with no clear solution. Courts-martial risk destroying the combat effectiveness of units we desperately need. Inaction means complicity in war crimes. The Allied command response was inconsistent and inadequate. Some Goumiers soldiers were court-martialed and punished. Many were not. The urgency of continuing military operations and desire to avoid publicizing Allied forces committing atrocities against liberated populations led to suppression and minimization of crimes that deserved systematic prosecution. This dark legacy complicates but does not erase the Goumiers' military achievement. The soldiers who broke the Gustav line demonstrated battlefield effectiveness that conventional Allied forces could not match in specific terrain and circumstances. They proved that unconventional tactics, cultural adaptation, and employment of specialized skills could overcome defensive systems that defeated conventional approaches. They also demonstrated that military effectiveness does not guarantee moral conduct and that commanders bear responsibility for both the victories and crimes of forces under their command. The tactical lessons of the Goumiers breakthrough resonated through military institutions for decades. American and British forces studying the Italian campaign recognized that their emphasis on firepower and mechanization had created vulnerability to enemies employing light infantry tactics in difficult terrain. The Goumiers' success proved that skilled infantry employing infiltration, night operations, and exploitation of terrain could accomplish objectives beyond the reach of armor and artillery. Soviet military analysts studying the Gustav Line battle drew different conclusions. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, reading translated accounts of Goumier operations, noted in a 1945 briefing to Stalin, "The Moroccan success in Italy demonstrates that properly employed light infantry remains relevant in modern warfare. The Germans made the error of assuming that modern defensive systems could stop all attacks. They forgot that fortifications can only defend areas they cover. The spaces between fortifications, if terrain is sufficiently difficult, become avenues for infiltration. This lesson has application for our operations against Germany's defensive lines." British military historian John Keegan, analyzing the Italian campaign in his comprehensive study of World War II mountain warfare, wrote, "The Goumiers' breakthrough at the Gustav Line represents one of the war's most remarkable tactical achievements. They succeeded not through superior numbers or firepower, but through cultural adaptation of skills developed in pre-industrial mountain warfare. Their success proved that technological sophistication cannot always compensate for tactical unsuitability to terrain and mission. The Allies had deployed divisions equipped with the finest weapons modern industry could produce. But those weapons were designed for warfare on plains and roads. The Goumiers brought knives, rifles, and centuries of mountain warfare experience. In the Aronsy Mountains, the latter proved more valuable than the former. American Special Forces, studying unconventional warfare tactics in the 1950s, examined Goumier operations extensively. Training manuals developed at Fort Bragg cited the Gustav Line breakthrough as exemplary employment of light infantry in difficult terrain. Doctrine emphasizing night operations, Silent movement, infiltration tactics, and exploitation of enemy weaknesses drew directly from Goumier methods observed in Italy. The Goumiers themselves returned to Morocco after the war with reputations as elite fighters, but also with the burden of documented war crimes. Many veterans struggled with the contradiction between pride in military achievement and shame over atrocities committed. Moroccan independence movements in the 1950s included former Goumiers who applied skills learned fighting for France against French colonial authorities, a bitter irony not lost on French commanders who had recruited and trained them. Si Mohammed Ben Ali, the Goumier sergeant who fought at the Gustav line, reflected on the experience in a 1965 interview as an elderly man. "We went to Italy to fight Germany for France. We were told this was a war for freedom and justice. We fought well. We broke German lines that stopped Allied armies. We were respected as warriors, but we were also treated as savages, blamed for crimes while French officers who commanded us escaped responsibility. We were good enough to die in French service, but not good enough to receive the respect due soldiers. Many of us learned from this. When Morocco sought independence, we remembered how France used us in war, but refused us dignity and peace. The skills we learned fighting Germans, we used fighting French colonialism. That was justice of a kind." The final accounting of the Goumiers' achievement requires acknowledging both extraordinary military effectiveness and serious moral failures. They broke the Gustav line when Allied armies failed. They demonstrated tactical innovation and cultural combat skills that conventional forces could not replicate. They also committed war crimes that brought suffering to innocent civilians and dishonored the military profession. Both truths exist simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. The Gustav line breakthrough proved that defensive systems, however sophisticated, contain vulnerabilities that unconventional approaches can exploit. The Germans had created fortifications designed to stop conventional attacks along predictable routes. They succeeded perfectly against such attacks. They failed catastrophically against unconventional attacks from unpredictable directions, employing tactics outside their doctrinal experience. This pattern repeated throughout military history whenever defenders optimized for expected threats and left gaps against unexpected approaches. Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich von Senger und Etterlin, the German officer who read the first reports of Goumier penetration with trembling hands, survived the war and wrote extensively about defensive warfare. In his 1960 memoir, he reflected on the Gustav line's collapse. "We built the perfect fortress to stop the attacks we anticipated. We succeeded against British armor, American firepower, and Polish courage. We failed against Moroccan mountain fighters because we never imagined such an attack was possible. Our intelligence told us the Goumiers were primitive colonial troops. Our doctrine told us the terrain they infiltrated was impassable for military operations. Both assessments proved fatally wrong. The Goumiers were not primitive. They were specialized in skills we did not possess. The terrain was not impassable. It was only impassable for us. That distinction cost us the Gustav line and ultimately Rome. The Moroccan Goumiers who climbed impossible mountains in darkness, who killed German sentries silently, who appeared where German commanders swore no soldiers could go, proved a fundamental truth about warfare that transcends technology and doctrine. Victory flows not merely from superior equipment or numbers, but from appropriate application of skills to specific circumstances. The Allies had deployed divisions armed with the finest weapons industrial civilization could produce. Those forces battered themselves to ruin against the Gustav line. Then came warriors from Atlas mountain villages, carrying knives and rifles and skills refined in pre-industrial tribal warfare. They succeeded where modern armies failed because their skills matched the mission perfectly. The mathematics of the impossible were rewritten in 72 hours by 12,000 men who proved that impossible was merely a failure of imagination, that impassable was simply terrain, Defenders could not navigate that impregnable was a fortress concept vulnerable to enemies who attacked from directions fortification designers never considered. The Gustav Line stood for 149 days against everything Allied conventional forces could deploy. It fell in 3 days to men German intelligence dismissed as primitive auxiliaries unsuited for modern warfare. That remains the Goumiers' military legacy, carried in the memories of German survivors who feared the sound of silent death in darkness, written in the tactical manuals of armies studying unconventional warfare, proven in the fall of Rome that opened the path to ultimate Allied victory in Italy. They were warriors from another time fighting a modern war, and for 3 days in May 1944, their ancient skills proved more valuable than all the tanks and artillery the modern world could deploy. The Gustav Line stood until it met enemies who did not fight by its rules. Then it fell, and with it the illusion that technological sophistication guaranteed victory regardless of circumstances. The mountain fighters from Morocco taught the Wehrmacht, the British Army, the American forces, and military historians a lesson written in blood and darkness across Italian mountains. That warfare's fundamentals, surprise, infiltration, exploitation of enemy weakness, psychological dominance, matter more than any technological advantage, and that the soldiers best adapted to specific terrain and mission will triumph over forces better equipped but less suited to the battlefield they face. The Goumiers broke the Gustav Line not despite being primitive mountain tribesmen, but because they were mountain warriors facing valley soldiers in mountain warfare. That made all the difference.